All right, so are we happy with what we're seeing now? Everybody should be seeing a work in progress.
Yes.
Okay, great.
No,
No?
yeah, I have dual screens and I'm seeing Grant on both of them, but that apparently is my problem. Let me screw with it.
All right, so I'll start by saying that this is very much a work in progress. What started out as an idea of just sharing some of the latest things I've seen with TNCs and some developments evolved after a conversation with both Scott and us. I apologize, I didn't have time to plug in Steve's call. I don't have it memorized. It really became, especially after talking with Steve, the idea of explaining more about where TNCs have come from and where they're probably headed and how that might relate to you as an individual, what you might be looking for in a TNC. As I said, I very much would love feedback in the future for this. Still working on a place that will stick the Word document and the PDF so that we can get some improvement on it. And that is it for that. Let's find the right arrow button to move things forward. There we go. So we'll start out with what's a TNC. It really is, in its simplest form, it's just a device that lays in between the radio and a terminal, and it does all the job of converting the digital data to audio tones so that it can be sent over the air, and going the opposite direction, converting audio tones back to digital data for a terminal to use. What you have inside the TNC is some hardware, and depending upon what generation we're talking about, it's going to vary a little bit. But at its core, all TNCs have a microprocessor, they have a modem, they have software in the device that controls how it works, implements the protocols, kind of does the magical thing that the TNC does of making audio tones into useful data and vice versa. Here's a couple of different drawings of how you'd use a TNC. You can see that in this case, particularly the lower diagram, can you see my mouse? No? Yes, maybe.
I can see
Scott?
Yes, I can see.
Okay, great, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, so you can see in the lower diagram, the most simple layout of all, it's really just a laptop or a computer. The terminal node controller acts as an interface between that and the radio. In the upper diagram, you can see a little bit more detail, some of the detail of what the TNC is actually doing, that it's controlling the push-to-talk line, it's controlling some other functions of the terminal node controller. And in this case, it's showing that it's handling this for a dumb terminal or a computer. And this is going to get more important as we talk about how the terminal node controller was developed. And up until about the last, I think about 10, 12 years, TNCs have primarily had a serial interface to a computer. As that serial interface went away, we upgraded to a USB interface, which is still a serial interface, but it's, as we didn't see conventional RS-232 interfaces on computers anymore, we had to upgrade. So the first TNCs came from this idea that the University of Hawaii developed, which was the idea of connecting remote users to their mainframe via wireless packet data network. The terminal node controller at that time was known as a terminal control unit, or TCU, and the package consisted of a UHF antenna, the radio, a modem, a buffer, and a control unit that did a lot of the work of organizing the data. And you can see in the picture on the right-hand side, the woman is using a dumb terminal And I don't, when I found this picture this afternoon, I was trying to decide, I don't think it's a VT100, but I know I recognize it. So I'm not sure if anybody can identify that terminal or not, but that was really the origin of the terminal node controller right there. That box to the right of her had all the guts in it. And you can see down below there how they had the distributed network. So TNCs come along, and hams in Montreal start experimenting with transmitting VHF over VHF, just ordinary data, just ASCII encoded data. They start playing with this idea, and then you had Doug Lockhart here in British Columbia, along with the Vancouver, I should have put in there what that stands for. The, oh, sorry. So it was the Vancouver Area Digital Communication Group is what that stood for. They designed and produced the first hardware TNC specifically for amateur radio use. That was a big watershed moment. And Tapper, I'm a little ignorant of the history of the formation of Tapper, but what led from the Vancouver group's efforts was the production of the first TNC, which was, as Steve so cutely told me, it was just known as the TNC before there was the TNC2. It was a 80 or a 6809 based TNC. One of the things that I didn't have an opportunity to delve into was why the TNC2 design changed and used as Z80. I'm actually I did see that Steve was around. Steve, if you're familiar with why that happened, I think it might be a worthwhile injection at this point to explain why the Tapper design changed from the 88 or the 6809 to the Z80. Are you aware?
Yeah, it was just easier to develop software, assembly code software, because there was so much more, so many more computers out there based on the Z80 than the 6809.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so so you had at that point, most of the manufacturers were licensing the TNC2 design, the Z80 based design. I cracked open my AE, well, actually it's the Hewlett Packard licensed kit of the AEA PK232, and yeah, sure enough, a Z80 in there. And in the Cantronics, I Googled the design because I didn't want to take my TNC apart since it's my APR station right now. And indeed, it still uses a Motorola processor. So they've stayed true to the use of the 6800 series design there. So as computing power grew, the fact that the TNC had a microprocessor in it that was managing a lot of the functions of the TNC moved from being an advantage to being a disadvantage. The idea of offloading a lot of the work that a TNC could do from the TNC to the computer and turning the TNC to nothing more than a modem would be a big improvement because it would provide a lot more versatility. And that was, I think, part of where the name came from. The KISS name, we've all heard it, you know, keep it simple, stupid. So with a KISS TNC, you have the computer managing everything except for the modulation and demodulation. So the TNC really does, in KISS mode, function as little more than a modem. One of the advantages also is that it's quite a bit less expensive. I'll talk about a TNC that Steve and I have both purchased and are working with that theoretically, if you shop well, it costs less than $40. So that's quite a bit less expensive than a Cantronics TNC now sells for, I believe it's more than $200. So the next step, as we saw computer performance increase, was people developing a software TNC or a TNC where all of the work was done inside the computer, including the analog to digital and digital to analog conversion, and that being handled by a sound card. And this is subtly different than the sound card modes. It's the same concept, but in result, well, I guess it's the same in result too, I guess. It really is that we're no longer using an outboard device to handle modulation and demodulation, and the computer is responsible for and wired directly to the radio. I don't have a lot of personal experience with software modems. I'm familiar with Direwolf, but I'm not familiar enough to say in what specific circumstances it's better or worse. I'm aware of other modes as well, and we'll talk about those. But the whole idea of this movement from a KISS TNC to a software TNC is exciting because it allows quite a bit more experimentation in terms of how you encode and decode the signal. It really does give a person quite a bit more freedom to experiment. And thanks to Scott for this wonderful list. We can give some examples here. I'll work backwards with the software TNC. So we have the original software TNC, the AGW PE software designed by, I don't have in my notes his name, in Greece. Then we have Direwolf. Well, we have this series of different software TNCs. And we have with the KISS, the hardware TNCs, you have the TNCX. And also in that category with the TNCX, you also have the TNC Pi. The TNC Pi is really nothing more than a hat for a Raspberry Pi, whereas the TNCX relies on a USB connection to a host computer. With the TNC Pi, it's basically using the general purpose input-output pins to connect it, and it's a teeny little package. You could kind of look at that as a computer and TNC all rolled into one. So in some ways, that's kind of the ultimate evolution of a KISS TNC. And I thought I had some, maybe I do have some pictures in here. Huh. Nope. I apologize. I thought somewhere in here I had saved a couple of pictures of TNCs, but that must not have gotten saved before I moved it to the server.
So, Grant, there's something else that occurs to me.
Yes.
On the list, there's a category that's not kind of strictly represented there, which is these. So the software TNCs connect instead of serially, like all the other full-featured and KISS TNCs just connect via some serial interface, right? Either RS-232 or USB. Yeah. Software TNCs connect as an IP port. So that's how the software interfaces with them. Yeah. And there's this other option, which is the Northwest Digital Radio product. There's a couple of these out there, right? What's the name of their thing? Their
drawers.
Yeah, the draws device, right? Which is, it's basically a Pi running a software TNC that's built into hardware with a network port. So instead of interfacing your software, your data software with a software TNC, you're accessing a hardware TNC that's running in a software mode. It's kind of a confusing combination, but it gives you a hardware TNC again, and some of the virtues of a hardware TNC.
Well,
and then there's also, to add to that, so there's the Nexus what is it, DRX, digital interconnects, which is also a hat for the Raspberry Pi. So you're right, Scott. There is a category that fits kind of in between there. And who else? There was somebody else in there that wanted to talk.
Steve?
Well, I functionally the category that Scott's talking about is no different than a software TNC. It's merely a sound card connected to a computer. In this case, the computer happens to be dedicated to the task. Happens to be a $35 Raspberry Pi, but functionally, it's no different than any of these other sound card modes. Just, you know, and Scott's correct. It's one of the beauties of it is that you can put it up off in the corner of your shack and connect to it with your big computer, you know, running your big display. It's not a dedicated device. It just lives on your network.
Yeah, that's a very good point to have brought up, Steve. I do think it's nice that we continue to see these evolutions. Really, the AGWPE software was the first step, and that caught my attention way back when. I loved the idea of being able to connect a TNC to, or not a TNC, but connect a radio to a computer and stick the computer close to the antenna, and then be able to access a TNC via the network for APRS or whatever other purpose I felt like that day. So that certainly was the first step. And then now we're seeing, with the hardware that we're talking about with drawers and the Nexus board and some of these others, it's this moving into the realm of being able to truly treat the whole TNC package, the radio, well, even to the radio, depending upon how you're able to package that, treating it as an appliance, an awful lot like way back when that box really was just the box that you plugged into, in that case, their network, and it provided the connectivity. So in some ways, I see this kind of heading full circle. So I took this list off of the page that Coastal Chipworks had for to help people think about a choice of using the TNCX versus their kit versus a traditional TNC. And I thought it was actually very good because they didn't try to hide the ball or make it seem like the TNCX was a far superior device to everything else. What they really did was they said, you know, if you want these traditional TNC functions, you want to play with a mailbox, you want to run a BBS, you want to use these direct modes, the command and converse modes, a traditional TNC is absolutely the way to go because that's the only way you're going to get it. If you want to simply have a radio modem that is going to take care of the modulation and demodulation, and you're going to do everything else in software. In other words, you want to just use the TNC as an appliance. The TNCX or any other KISS TNC is absolutely the way to go. And I've got to say from personal experience that couldn't be more spot on. For my APRS activities, I really don't want to screw around with a traditional TNC until I figured out exactly the right way to write the startup file for APRS IS. It was kind of a pain in the ass that my Cantronics TNC, which has both a traditional mode and a KISS mode, would jump out of the KISS mode, and it would take me quite some time to figure out something was wrong. I'd have to go and restart everything, and it was such a pain in the butt. Whereas with a KISS TNC, it would be virtually impossible for it to get out of that mode. It would have to fail in order to not do its job. But I've also had a lot of fun playing with the functions of a traditional TNC. It is actually a little exciting to connect to somebody else and to have a terminal-to-terminal chat. And that making those connections is really a big part of amateur radio. When we reach out, whether it's via CW or digital mode or voice via sideband or FM, talking to another ham is part of the magic of amateur radio and part of what draws at least some of us to this hobby. So I think it's important to recognize that there's definitely still a role for traditional TNCs. There always will be.